Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today we're going to build this knife block from sapelli. When we're cooking, we like to use nice knives, but we don't have any place to keep them. At least no place where their edges won't get all banged up. And since we only use a few knives, a simple knife block seemed like the answer. And when I saw this piece of 8/4 sapelli at my lumberyard, I knew what I had to do. Let's see how it came together.
When I drew up the plans for this project in SketchUp, I had some problems visualizing some of the angles. Once I had it where I thought I wanted it, I cut out some manila folders and built a prototype. This was a big help, and I did have some of the angles wrong in my drawing. Better to find out with manila folders and expensive exotic woods. Like most of my projects, this one started at the miter saw to cut my stock to length. And despite losing the actual cutting footage, I cut my stock into 4 pieces at 12 inches long. That's longer than I need, but they will have to go through my planer, and that's the minimum length I'm comfortable sending through it. Despite their short length, each of the pieces still had a bit of twist to them. To flatten the first face, I used a piece of MDF as a reference surface and hot melt the stock to it. If the twist was more severe, I'd have used shims and hot melt to ensure that the stock stayed stable on the MDF. And since this stock was so short, I was able to set up 2 pieces at a time. I also used a white charcoal pencil to mark the face of my stock, so I'd know when it was finally flat. I set my planer to take a light cut and sent the stock through. As I said, the twist was fairly light, and the first face was cleaned up in one pass. Once I had a flat face on all my pieces, I reset the planer height and ran them all through to make the second face parallel to the first. You can't see it here, but I used the white charcoal pencil on this face too. Moving over to the table saw, I got out my straight edge jig that I got from Drew over at Fisher's shop and trimmed one edge of each piece so that it was square to the 2 faces. A joiner would be great here, but I don't have one yet, so this is going to have to do for now. With that complete, I could lose the jig and cut the second edge parallel to the first. The piece of sapelli I picked up was a little too narrow for this project, so the first 2 passes were just to give me 2 clean edges to work with. Then I reset my fence and cut 2 additional pieces that I could use to glue up to give me the 5-inch width that I needed. Before making my last rip cuts, I had to clean up the end of the offcuts I just made. Often you'll get this little burr on the end of your board, and if you try to run that against your fence, you'll end up with a tapered cut. A quick swipe with a chisel and the burr is gone. With a smooth edge, I could cut the stock for the small foot piece in the front of the knife block. This foot piece is thinner than the main part of the block, so I set up to resaw the stock to just over 1 inch. I raised the blade to just over halfway through the height of the stock and cut the pieces in 2 passes, making sure that I registered the same face against the fence. Once the stock had been milled down, I started finding a lot of internal stress fractures. This probably came from the drying process and isn't a big deal for a small project like this. I just have to be careful to hide as many of the fractures as possible during glue-ups. Before starting the glue-up, I made marks where necessary to remind me where the damage areas are. Then I could apply some glue and spread it around for a good bond. To save time and clamps, I glued these first 2 pieces at the same time. Just make sure that each pair of boards you're gluing up stays in the same plane while you're clamping them. A C-clamp on each end of the joint helps keep things in line. Now you can tighten your bar clamps and wipe off the excess glue. The 2 smaller pieces got glued together as well, and everything was set aside to dry. Once the glue was dry, it was back to the planer. I've said this before, but when sizing stock, it's best to take an equal number of passes off each face. Several passes later, and I had reduced the 2 pieces down to 1.5 inches each. I used the same process with the small foot piece, taking a pass off each side until I reached its final width of 2 inches. Back at the miter saw, I squared off one end of each piece. Then I set a stop to cut the blanks to length. Well, a little bit longer than that, just in case. One more trip to the table saw and I ripped the larger pieces to their final width. With that done, I marked up my 2 pieces, determining their mating faces and the tops. I also marked which edge would go next to the fence and the direction of feed so I wouldn't get mixed up in the next step. I set my fence a ½ inch away from the blade and set the blade height to a ½ inch. I ran each of the 2 large pieces with the mating faces down. I could then raise my blade to 7/8 of an inch high and move my fence over so there is 1 inch between the kerf and the saw blade. Keeping the same edge against the fence, I ran the 2 pieces again. I kept the blade at the same height for now and moved the fence again, leaving 1 inch between the kerf and the blade, and ran both pieces. I made sure to keep that same edge against the fence. Then I raised the blade to a total height of 1 inch and ran the stock again. I switched out my rip blade for a ½ inch dado set, but this cut could also be done with multiple passes with your rip blade. I set my blade height for ½ an inch and moved the fence to once again leave me 1 inch between the last kerf and the dado set. Then I ran both pieces of stock one more time. Here you can see the block starting to take shape. 3 different kerf sizes for the knives we use, and 1 larger for the steel or, that sharpening thingy. Here you can clearly see the marks I used to keep my work in order. You may also notice that the kerf for the steel is a bit larger than it needs to be. Don't tell anyone, but I messed up. Those cuts should have been 1/4 of an inch deep, so the finish opening is only a ½ inch square. Not to worry, I have a plan. I milled up 2 strips that were a ½ inch wide and 1/4 of an inch thick and just long enough to fill the blocks. I also milled up 2 strips of scrap wood to be used as clamping cauls and cover them with tape. The tape will prevent the cauls from sticking to the block should there be any glue squeeze out. A bead of glue, the cauls, and some quick grip clamps are all that's needed to secure these strips in place. Now it's time to glue the 2 halves of the block together. A light bead of glue goes on one of the mating faces. I was careful not to use too much glue that might cause squeeze out into the knife slots. To keep the 2 halves lined up, I cut down some plexi scraps that I had laying around to use as keyways. The plexi was just a bit undersized, so I added a few layers of tape to make sure they were a snug fit. 1 pair went into the smallest knife slot, and another went into the largest knife slot. Then I could set the blocks into my clamps and lock them down. Once the glue had dried, it was back to the miter saw, where I squared off the top of the block. I adjusted my blade to 30 degrees, lined up the blade with the corner of the block, and clamped it in place. When you cut a miter on a saw, the stock has a tendency to get pulled into the blade during the cut, throwing off your angle. Clamping it down prevents this. And since this stock is fairly hard and pretty thick, I took several passes to cut through it. Oh, and save that cutoff. You're going to need that later. While you've got the saw at 30 degrees, make the first cut on the front piece of the small footstock. I flipped the blade to the other side, but still at 30 degrees. Then I grabbed a jig I picked up from Tamara over at 3x3 Custom for what can best be described as a sketchy cut. The jig is clamped to the saw bed, and the mitered end of the foot is just touching the saw fence. Now I can clamp the stock to the jig and make the second angled cut. Here you can see how the 2 pieces will come together. Now I could just glue them since it's a long grain joint and that's fairly strong, but I decided to go with something a little bit different. But first, a little sanding. The face and the edges of the sapelli cleaned up fairly well, but that tough end grain takes some work. I started with 120 grit on my random orbit sander and followed that with 150 grit, and that's far enough for now. I laid out 2 marks about a ½ inch off the center line near the wider part of the angled foot. I used an awl to mark the center point and chucked up a 1/4 inch brad point bit in my drill press. I set the bit depth and drilled the 2 holes. Then I could put a dowel point in each hole, lined up the angled foot, and gave it a light tap with my mallet. The dowel points left small indentations on the foot where I would drill the mating holes. Okay, remember that angled cutoff I mentioned we'd need later? Well, it's time. I used some double stick tape to tape the angled foot to the scrap. And yes, there's another line on the stock to make sure that I'm drilling in the correct direction. After adjusting the table height and the bit depth, I can drill the 2 holes into the angled face of the foot. Oh yeah, and save that cutoff again, because we're going to need it one more time. A quick test with some 1/4 inch dowel pins, and things lined up better than I hoped. I mean, just like I planned. Before assembling the 2 pieces, I decided to sand everything, starting with 150 grit again, and working my way through 220, and then finishing with 320 grit. I also used the 320 grit to ease the edges of the block. I put a little glue on the foot and a dab on each of the dowel pins. After inserting the pins into the foot, I added another dab on each pin before assembling the 2 pieces. Now I used that same offcut as a clamping caul to keep things square, and while it didn't move in my dry run, it did this time. One more piece of double stick tape did the trick to hold it in place while I tightened my clamp. And while a 24-inch K-body clamp might seem like overkill for a glue-up like this, I chose this clamp as its wide face is less likely to leave any marks on my freshly sanded block. The last step was to scrape away any glue squeeze out before it dried. Once the glue had time to dry, it was time to level the bottom of the 2 pieces. They glued up pretty closely, but a little sanding got them on the same plane. I also made a point to resand where the double stick tape was on the opposite side. One last bit of cleanup by hand using a light touch and some 220 grit paper, I cleaned up around the glue joint and eased any edges that were still sharp to the touch. I also sanded the inside of each of the slots, top and bottom, to remove any remaining rough spots or stray fibers. The last thing to do was put a finish on the knife block. I chose to use a food-safe mineral oil. This is the same finish I use on my cutting boards. It's easy to apply and maintain over time. The first coat, I just wipe the oil on with a rag and leave it to soak in. The subsequent coats are wiped on, and then any excess oil is wiped off about 20 minutes later. A few coats of this over the course of several days, and this block will be ready for the kitchen. And if you're wondering about those feet that I'm using under the block, they're just pieces of 2x4 cut to a point. Their width provides plenty of support, and the pointed tip minimizes the contact with the finish. I also put down a new piece of tape each time I change my finish. If I had left the painted white tape there, the paint most likely would have transferred to the bottom of the knife block, and we don't want that.
One of my first woodworking projects when I was like 12 was a knife block that my mom still has. One of the improvements that this knife block has over many is that the knives rest on their sides and not their sharp edges. Another improvement this knife block has over that original one is it was made in pine and stained dark and has an eagle screwed on its face, where this naturally oiled sapelli just looks amazing. Now, our good knives can be kept handy and they'll be protected at the same time. Wonder if Mom will let me finally update that old block of hers. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this project. Was there something I could have done differently, easier, smarter, safer? Put them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. I don't have a clue what's coming up next, but it might be something interesting. So for now, stay safe, have a great day, and take care. We'll see you soon.